7 officers were bleeding out on a warehouse floor when a rookie dog nobody trusted did the one thing no trainer ever taught him. He didn't wait for a command. He didn't look for permission. He moved. Straight into the smoke, straight into the chaos, like he had already been there before. They called it beginner's luck. They said he got lucky. They said a dog that knew couldn't possibly understand what was happening. Then Captain Elise Duran stepped out of that black SUV and asked a single question that made every officer on the lot go completely still. Where did that dog come from? Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The call came in at 6:47 in the morning, and from the first crackle of the radio, it felt wrong. Officer Caleb Marsh was still pulling on his duty gloves when dispatch repeated the address. Abandoned textile warehouse on the east end of Harlow City. Narcotics sweep gone sideways. Units requesting backup. Multiple officers down. He was 25 years old, 3 months into his canine assignment, and every instinct he had told him to floor it. Valor was already up in the back of the patrol vehicle, shifting his weight, ears forward. The dog could feel it too. Whatever was happening 2 miles east of them, it had already started without them. Caleb hit the lights and punched the accelerator. "You hear that?" he said over his shoulder. Valor pressed his nose to the mesh partition and made a sound low in his chest. Not a bark. Something quieter. Something knowing. Caleb didn't ask again. He just drove. By the time they reached the outer perimeter, the scene had already collapsed into controlled disaster. 2 patrol cruisers sat at hard angles across the lot entrance, doors flung open, nobody behind them. A third vehicle had a shattered windshield. Radio chatter was fractured, voices overlapping, coordinates getting dropped mid-sentence. Someone kept calling for a medic on Channel 4 and not getting an answer. Sergeant Dale Pruitt was the first officer Caleb saw when he stepped out. Pruitt was a 20-year veteran who Caleb had never once seen rattle. Right now, his shirt was torn at the collar, his left hand was wrapped in a blood-stained rag, and he was issuing orders to 2 younger officers who both looked like they were trying very hard not to run. "Marsh!" Pruitt grabbed his arm before Caleb could even speak. "We've got 7 down inside. Active threat is contained, but we can't get a clean entry. There's something wrong with the structural layout in there. Comms are cutting out every 20 feet. Medevac is 40 minutes out, minimum." 40 minutes, Caleb repeated. "Don't say it like that. I already know." Pruitt looked at Valor. "What can he do?" "He can find people," Caleb said. "And he can find things that shouldn't be there." Pruitt stared at him. "He's been certified what, 8 weeks?" 10. A pause. "Get him in there." Caleb unclipped the leash. Valor didn't bolt. He moved in a controlled sweep, nose dropping to the ground the second they crossed the threshold into the building. His ears rotated forward, then to the left, then back. Every few steps he paused, reassessed, corrected his direction. Caleb stayed close, hand near his radio, watching the dog the same way a surgeon watches a monitor. The interior smelled like chemical residue and old concrete. Voices echoed from somewhere deep in the eastern corridor, strained and low. Caleb could make out at least 2 of them. One kept saying the same thing over and over in a tight, controlled loop. "Stay with me. Stay with me. Stay with me." Valor stopped. Not a gradual slowing, a full, complete stop in the middle of the corridor. "What is it?" Caleb said quietly. The dog's head dropped. His nose pushed along the floor in short, rapid passes. Then he sat. Clean, rigid, perfectly still. Ears forward, eyes fixed on a point 2 feet ahead of his paws. Caleb looked down. The concrete looked ordinary. Dust, debris, the kind of floor that 1,000 people had walked across and never thought twice about. But Valor didn't move. He didn't even twitch. Caleb keyed his radio. "March to all units. Hold position. Do not advance through the east corridor. Repeat, do not advance." He crouched, pulled his flashlight, and ran the beam along the ground in front of the dog. There, a wire, barely visible, running along the base of the wall. Thin enough to miss at a run. Connected to something behind a collapsed piece of shelving. Something that had been placed deliberately, recently, with the kind of patience that didn't belong to amateurs. His mouth went dry. "Secondary device located. East corridor, 40 feet from entry point. K9 flagging. Requesting EOD immediately." The radio spit back static. Then Pruitt's voice cut through. "Confirmed. Pulling back outer units. You good?" Caleb looked at Valor. Valor hadn't moved an inch. He was still sitting beside that wire like he was prepared to stay there until the building fell down around him. "We're good," Caleb said. It took 11 minutes for EOD to neutralize the device. 11 minutes where Valor sat in that corridor without a single command to hold him there, without Caleb's hand on his collar, without anything except whatever internal understanding the dog had apparently arrived at on his own. When the all clear came through, Caleb exhaled so hard his vision blurred for a second. "Good boy," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. Valor looked up at him, already turning toward the deeper section of the building. He wasn't done. The first officer they found was wedged against a collapsed pallet stack, conscious but barely. His name was Torres. Caleb had seen him twice at the precinct, a quiet man who kept a photo of his kids taped to his locker. Right now, Torres was pressing both hands against his left side and breathing in shallow, careful increments. "Help's coming," Caleb told him. "Stay still." Torres laughed, which dissolved into a cough. "Your dog is staring at me like I owe him money." Valor was already moving. Caleb scrambled to follow. The dog led him through a secondary room, past 2 more officers who were injured but mobile, past a point where the ceiling had partially buckled and the floor was littered with ceiling tile and broken glass. He didn't slow for any of it. He moved with the kind of purpose that made Caleb feel like he was the one being guided, not the other way around. The third room held 4 officers, 2 of them unconscious. Valor went directly to the one on the far left, a young officer named Reyes, still in his first year on the force. He had a gash across his forehead, and his breathing was wrong, a sound to it that suggested something internal was failing quietly. Valor sat beside him, pressed his muzzle against the man's wrist once, then looked back at Caleb. "I see it," Caleb said. He was already pulling his trauma kit. "I see it." He worked fast. Caleb had done the trauma certification twice and practiced it until the steps were reflex. But his hands were shaking now because this wasn't practice. This was Reyes, and Reyes had a name and a face and the wrong kind of breathing. He got an improvised seal over the chest wound. He tilted the airway. He checked the pulse. Valor moved to the next man before Caleb even finished. That was the part that stopped him cold for just a second. Not the emergency, not the blood. The fact that the dog was already 3 feet away, already crouched beside a second officer, already signaling. It wasn't sequencing by accident. It was triage. Caleb moved. He went from man to man the way Valor led him, and the dog was always a step ahead, always at the next most critical point. Always still and precise and unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with knowledge. By the time the medevac team came through the cleared corridor, Caleb had stabilized 4 of the 7. 2 more were mobile, with support. 1 was critical, but holding. 7 breathing. Caleb sank to one knee on the concrete floor. His gloves were soaked. His knees ached from crouching on hard ground. Every muscle in his back was pulling in a different direction. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead and just stayed there for a moment, not thinking, not moving. Valor walked back to him. He didn't make a sound. He just sat down directly beside Caleb's knee and leaned his weight into him, warm and solid and steady. Caleb dropped his hand and looked at the dog. 10 weeks. The dog had been in his unit for 10 weeks. He had passed his basic certification tests, passed the drug detection course, passed the patrol entry assessments. He had done everything a rookie canine was supposed to do and scored well on all of it. But rookie canine units hesitated. They looked to their handlers for feedback. They needed confirmation at every stage because they were still building trust in their own reads. Valor had not hesitated once. Not at the wire, not at the triage order, not at a single decision point across the entire hour. He had moved like a dog who had done this before, in a different place, at a different time, with a different person beside him. Caleb stared at the amber eyes looking back at him. "Who are you?" he said quietly. Valor held the look for a long moment. Then he turned and watched the medevac team carry Reyes past them on a stretcher, tracking the officer until he disappeared around the corner. Calm. Certain, like he was making sure the job was finished. Caleb sat with that question long after the warehouse was cleared, and the scene was secured, and the adrenaline had burned down to ash. He sat with it in the parking lot while he filled out the initial incident form. He sat with it while he typed the words that would later trigger something he didn't yet know existed. K9 Valor identified secondary IED without command, performed independent triage prioritization across 7 casualties, responded to non-standard vocal pattern Sierra 08 during final sweep. No training precedent on file. He hit submit. 3 states away, in a building with no exterior signage, a system that had been dormant for 4 years received a single notification. Asset Identifier 08 Victor. Status flag, active. The precinct lot never fully emptied after a scene like that. People found reasons to stay. They topped off coffee they weren't drinking, ran reports that could wait, stood near the lot entrance pretending to check their phones. What they were really doing was watching the kennel unit door like something was going to come through it that none of them were ready for. Caleb noticed. He noticed the way Sergeant Pruitt stopped mid-conversation when Valor walked past. He noticed how 2 patrol officers on the far side of the lot turned their backs a second too slowly, like they'd been watching and didn't want to be caught doing it. He noticed how nobody came to ask him how the dog was doing, how the scene was, how the 7 officers were holding up in the hospital. In the aftermath of something that should have generated noise, the precinct had gone quiet in exactly the wrong direction. He brought Valor inside and filled the water bowl without speaking. The dog drank, then sat beside the metal bench in the kennel corridor, perfectly composed. Caleb sat on the bench above him and stared at the wall. His incident report was already submitted. He knew that. He also knew that the phrase he'd typed, the one about Valor responding to a non-standard vocal pattern, was going to raise a flag somewhere. He hadn't been able to explain it any other way. During the final sweep of the building, someone on the radio had repeated a 2-syllable code he didn't recognize, Sierra 08. And Valor had stopped, mid-stride, turned 45 degrees left, and located a hiding position that turned out to contain a wounded officer who had stopped responding. Nobody on comms had claimed the phrase afterward. When Caleb asked Pruitt about it, Pruitt told him to write exactly what he observed and leave the interpretation to someone else. So he did. And now he was sitting in a kennel corridor, waiting for whatever that meant. It came faster than he expected. He heard the tires first, slow, deliberate. The kind of rolling that meant whoever was driving wasn't in a hurry, because they didn't need to be. Then the engine cut. One door. Just one. Caleb stood up before he consciously decided to. He stepped out into the lot and saw her immediately. Black SUV, no markings, parked at the edge of the administrative entrance. A woman in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks was walking toward the building's main door, with a leather case under one arm, and the kind of posture that said she had already decided what was going to happen today. She was in her mid-40s, silver threading her dark hair, face arranged in the particular expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Captain Elise Duran, Internal Affairs. Caleb had never spoken to her. He knew the name the way every patrol officer knew it, through the specific hush that fell over a room when she was mentioned. She didn't investigate bad arrests or paperwork problems. She investigated the kind of things that got sealed. She stopped when she saw him, looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then looked at Valor, who had followed Caleb out and was standing at his left side. "Officer Marsh," she said. "Captain." She didn't smile. "Where can we talk?" They sat in the small conference room off the main hallway, the one with the laminate table and the chair with the broken armrest that everyone left for whoever they liked the least. Duran set her case on the table and opened it without preamble. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't acknowledge the fact that he had spent the last 3 hours stabilizing bleeding officers in a condemned building. She pulled a tablet, unlocked it, and turned it to face him. "Is that your dog?" Caleb looked at the screen. A grainy photograph. Low resolution, shot in conditions that made everything blurry at the edges. But the outline was unmistakable. Tan and black coat. Long-backed, athletic. Ears at full attention. And the marking he knew better than his own reflection. A pale scar above the left brow, from a fence encounter during Valor's 2nd week of training. "That looks like him," Caleb said slowly. "That photograph is 4 years old," Duran said. "Taken during an active criminal investigation in this city. The dog in that image was assigned to a unit that was decommissioned 18 months into the operation." She tapped the screen again. A document came up, heavily redacted. Black bars across whole sections. But the header was visible. Operation Clearline. K9 Unit 08 Victor. Status: decommissioned. Handler: deceased. Caleb read the word deceased, and something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "That's wrong," he said. "He was assigned to me through the civilian contractor program. I have the paperwork. Transfer logs, health records, certification scores. Everything came through the standard channel." "I know what came through the standard channel," Duran said. "I'm telling you, the standard channel was used to move something that wasn't supposed to move." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Did anyone brief you on this dog's history before the assignment?" "No." "Did anything in his behavioral profile suggest prior advanced training?" Caleb almost laughed. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table. "I thought he was just a fast learner." "And now?" He looked up. "Now I think someone handed me a dog with a past they didn't disclose and called it a routine assignment." Duran nodded like that was the correct answer. "Your incident report flagged the Sierra 08 response." "Yeah." "That code is not in any active K9 training manual in this department or any department in this state." She held the eye contact steady. "It was used in clear-line field operations, internal only. It was supposed to be expunged from every active system when the operation was shut down." A pause. "So either someone in this building still has access to that language, or your dog remembered it without being told to." The room felt smaller. What was Operation Clearline? Caleb asked. Duran's jaw shifted slightly. That's a longer conversation. First, I need the dog scanned. She called in a department technician who ran the chip reader without making eye contact with Caleb. The number that came back made the technician type it in twice, like he was hoping for a different result. He handed Duran the printout, and she read it standing up. Her expression didn't change, but she set the paper down with a kind of careful deliberateness that people used when they needed a moment to decide something. 08 Victor, she said. The identifier is confirmed. She looked at Valor, who had been sitting at Caleb's left throughout the entire conversation, completely still, watching Duran with the specific attention he gave things he was filing away. He's been in your unit for 10 weeks? 10 weeks. And before that, he came from a civilian canine placement organization out of the North District? Millfield Canine Services. Licensed, bonded, DoD contractor certified. Doran picked up her tablet again, typed something, waited, then turned the screen around. Millfield Canine Services. License suspended 14 months ago. Active DoD contract status terminated. That organization hasn't legally transferred a canine unit in over a year, she said quietly. Whatever paperwork you received, Officer Marsh, it didn't come from them. It came from someone who knew enough about the process to replicate it. Caleb stared at the screen. Someone placed him deliberately. Someone moved him from wherever he'd been kept to this department, routed him through your assignment, and made sure he ended up in the field. She closed the tablet. The question I'm working on right now is whether that someone was trying to protect him or use him. Valor made a sound. Not quite a growl, not a bark. A low, concentrated exhale through the nose that both of them heard clearly. Duran looked at the dog for a long moment. Kennel him, she said finally. Secure holding. No access without my authorization. She stood up and gathered her case. You're on restricted duty until I say otherwise. Don't contact the civilian contractor. Don't discuss the Sierra 08 notation with anyone in this building. She paused at the doorway. And don't let anyone else near that dog tonight. Captain, Caleb stood. What happened to his original handler? Duran stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face had changed in a way that was subtle and unmistakable. Not softer, more careful. That's part of the longer conversation, she said. Then she walked out. Caleb stood in the empty conference room for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he looked at Valor. Valor was already on his feet. He walked to the doorway where Doran had just been standing and stopped. His nose worked the air in a tight pattern, 3 short pulls and a slow exhale. Then he turned back to Caleb. His amber eyes were steady, not anxious, not uncertain. The eyes of a dog who had been in a room exactly like this one before, with a person asking questions exactly like those, and who already knew where the next part of the story went, even if the person standing with him did not. Caleb clipped the leash back on. His hand was steady. His thoughts were not. He walked Valor to secure holding, settled him in, checked the latch twice. Through the chain link, the dog watched him with that same unbroken attention, that same quality of stillness that had stopped feeling like calm and started feeling like waiting. Waiting for something Caleb couldn't name yet. Back at his desk, he opened the incident report again and scrolled to the line about Sierra 08. He sat there reading it for a long time, and the longer he read it, the more clearly he understood that the worst part wasn't what he'd written. The worst part was that somewhere, someone had already read it first. Duran came back at 11 that night. No knock. She opened the door to the small briefing room off the kennel corridor, like she'd already decided he'd be there. And she was right. Caleb had been sitting in that room for 2 hours, with a cold cup of coffee, and the kind of silence that pressed on your eardrums. He'd read the Sierra '08 line in his incident report probably 30 times by then. It didn't get clearer. It just got more specific in the way it unsettled him. She set a thick folder on the table. Not a tablet this time. Actual printed pages. Some of them edges worn. Some of them carrying the pale ghost of old coffee rings and field handling. Documents that had been read many times before they reached this room. Operation Clearline, she said. I'm going to walk you through what I'm cleared to share, and then you're going to understand why your dog being alive is a problem for certain people. Caleb leaned forward and looked at the top page. The header was stamped in red. Compartmentalized. Dissemination restricted. Below that, a date from 4.5 years ago. Clearline started as an internal corruption investigation, Dorn said. A detective named Roy Haskell had been building a case for almost 2 years. Dirty money moving through seized asset accounts. Evidence getting misrouted before trial. Defense attorneys receiving case files that were supposed to be locked. It wasn't one person. It was a network, and it ran deep enough that Haskell couldn't trust anyone inside the building to help him finish it. So he used a canine unit, Caleb said. He used Valor. She slid a page across the table. An assignment log. Handler, Detective Roy Haskell. Canine designation, 08 Victor. Call sign, Valor. Haskell had Valor trained through a specialized behavioral program. Not standard patrol work. Pattern retention, route memory. The ability to identify individuals by scent across long time gaps. The ability to guide a handler through a compromised environment without verbal instruction. She paused. In plain language, he trained that dog to be a witness. Caleb looked up. A witness. Valor was with Haskell during every critical phase of the investigation. Every meeting with the defector who was cooperating. Every location where evidence was physically documented. Every face in that network. He didn't just see it. His training was designed so that he retained it in behavioral memory, in reaction patterns, in the way he moved and prioritized and responded. She pressed her finger to the page. If Valor walked into a room with one of the people from that network, he would identify them. Not with a formal alert, with his body. With the way his attention changed. Haskell built the dog to be the one piece of the case that couldn't be forged, buried, or paid off. The room felt like it had gotten colder. What happened to Haskell? Caleb asked, and he already didn't want the answer. Doran's voice didn't soften. He was killed 18 months into the investigation, along with 2 officers who were working the evidence chain with him and a third who had driven the cooperating witness to a safe location that same night. She slid another page across, a list of names. Roy Haskell at the top. The official report called it a criminal ambush. Wrong place, wrong time, connected to a separate narcotics operation. Case closed inside of 6 weeks. And Valor? Valor was declared lost at the scene, presumed dead. The Clearline file was classified above standard access, and the investigation was formally suspended, pending review. She let that land. A review that never happened. Caleb stared at the names on that page for a long time. Then he looked at the folder again. But he wasn't dead. Someone inside the program pulled him before the scene was processed. Someone who knew what he was, knew what he carried in that behavioral memory, and understood that terminating him was not something they could do in good conscience. Duran's voice dropped just enough that Caleb caught the weight behind it. That person spent 4 years keeping him off every grid, moving him through shelter rotations, keeping him quiet and alive, and waiting until there was a moment to put him somewhere he could be used again. Used, Caleb said. The word tasted wrong. Or protected, depending on who you ask. She closed the folder. What I know is that whoever placed Valor in your unit didn't do it randomly. They chose you specifically. A young handler, clean record, no connection to anyone in the original investigation. Someone who would take the assignment without asking too many questions, and who would be in the field, in a real situation, where what Valor actually is would eventually have to show itself. Caleb sat back. His chest felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. So I was the delivery mechanism. Doran didn't deny it. You were the cover. Valor was the message. She stood up and picked up the folder. Someone is trying to restart what Haskell started, and they needed Valor visible again to do it. She looked at him directly. The problem is that the people who buried Clearline are still here, still operating. And the moment your incident report went into the system with that Sierra 08 flag, they got the same notification I did. The words sat in the air between them. They know he's real, Caleb said. They've known since this morning. He was on his feet before he decided to be. Then why is he still in secure holding? If they know where he is, because this building is still controlled space. They won't move on him here. She said it with the confidence of someone who wasn't entirely sure, but needed him to hold steady. Not tonight. Caleb looked at the door. And the 7 officers in the hospital? Doran paused. Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and controlled. Why? Because Valor guarded the most critical one for 20 minutes without instruction. Not me. The dog made that decision. If that officer saw something, heard something, was part of something connected to the Clearline network, even without knowing it. Caleb stopped. Valor would know. From scent, from behavioral memory. He sat beside that man specifically. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Doran already had her phone out. She got 3 words into the call before the precinct alert system activated. A low, pulsing tone that cycled twice, then a sharp double burst that was not a test. The overhead panel light in the corridor switched from white to amber. Base-wide notification. Unscheduled perimeter entry. West access point. Unauthorized personnel. Possible internal breach. Caleb was already moving. He hit the kennel corridor at a run and had the secure holding latch open in 4 seconds. Valor came out at full attention. No warm-up, no adjustment. His nose was already working. He turned immediately toward the east hallway, toward the passage that connected the administrative side of the building to the medical annex, where the department's internal recovery ward held the 2 most critical officers from the morning's warehouse scene. East Corridor, Caleb said into his radio. K9 unit mobile. Someone tell me what we have on West access. The response came back broken. 2 voices overlapping. Unknown individual. No badge register. Black clothing. Last confirmed position moving toward the internal wing. Valor was already ahead of him. The dog moved fast and clean. No hesitation at junctions. Cutting left, then right. Then stopping at the far end of the recovery annex hallway so abruptly that Caleb almost ran into him. The dog's body dropped low, not a crouch of fear, the crouch of precision. His ears locked forward, and his growl came out barely above a vibration. A figure was at the far end of the corridor. Black clothing, no badge, gloved, moving toward the door of the second recovery room with a focused, practiced calm that did not belong to someone who was lost or confused. This was not a mistake. This was a professional. "Don't move," Caleb called out. "Harlow PD, hands where I can see them." The figure turned. For 1 second, they evaluated each other across that corridor. Then the figure moved toward the door handle, fast, committing. Valor launched. He crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds, came in low and angled, hit the figure's weapon-side arm with everything he had. The impact was controlled and total. The figure went down hard against the wall, and Valor held position with his teeth locked on the bicep, body braced, completely silent, except for the focused intensity of his breathing. No barking, no display, just absolute mechanical certainty. Caleb had his weapon drawn and was at the figure's position in seconds. Boot on the drop device, hands secured. He keyed his radio. Contact down, recovery annex corridor, requesting backup and medical. The figure didn't struggle, didn't speak. Lay still with a particular composure of someone trained to be caught without breaking. Caleb crouched and pulled back the front panel of the jacket, looking for ID, looking for anything. What he found was a small rectangular badge clipped to the inside chest pocket. No name, no photograph, just a designation printed in clean black type. Clearline Internal Recovery Unit, Tier 3, Access. Caleb read it twice. He looked at Valor, who had released his hold the moment the figure stopped resisting, and was now sitting 6 inches away, watching the downed individual with the same level of attention he gave everything. Alert, measuring, entirely without doubt. Doran arrived with 2 officers 30 seconds later. She took one look at the badge, and her expression confirmed everything Caleb had been putting together since she walked in with that folder. "They didn't come to investigate," she said, almost to herself. "No," Caleb said. "They came to make sure whoever is in that room doesn't talk." Doran crouched beside the figure, studied the face, and then said something Caleb didn't expect. "I know this person," she said quietly. "He processed the evidence closure on Clearline." She stood up slowly. Her voice had the quality of someone recalibrating in real time. "He's the one who signed the termination order for 08 Victor 4 years ago." Caleb looked at Valor. Valor was already looking back at him. And then the dog did something that made every officer in that corridor go quiet. He stood up, walked past the restrained figure without a second glance, and pressed his nose to the seam at the bottom of the recovery room door. One long, slow inhale. Then he sat, perfectly still, facing the door. Not guarding, recognizing. Someone on the other side of that door was connected to Operation Clearline, connected to Roy Haskell, connected to the reason that dog had spent 4 years being kept alive in silence. Caleb looked at Doran. She was already reaching for her phone. The officer in that recovery room was named Brennan. Patrol veteran, 14 years in the force, 3 commendations, 1 disciplinary note from 6 years ago that had been quietly expunged. He had been one of the 7 in the warehouse. Shrapnel in the left shoulder. Bruised sternum, currently stable. When Doran pushed the door open and stepped inside with Caleb behind her, Brennan was sitting up in the hospital bed with his eyes already open, like he'd heard everything through the wall and had been waiting for the door to move. He looked at Valor first. Something crossed his face that wasn't surprise. It was the expression of a man watching a thing he had convinced himself wasn't real walk through the door and prove him wrong. "You know this dog," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Brennan looked at him, then at Doran, then back at the dog. Valor had come in quietly and was sitting just inside the doorway, ears forward, completely still. Not aggressive, not uncertain. The same recognition posture he'd held at the door seam 2 minutes ago. "I knew his handler," Brennan said. His voice was rough, partly from the oxygen tube he'd had most of the day, partly from something else. "Roy Haskell. We came up together. Same class. Same precinct rotation. First 3 years on the job." He shifted against the bed. The movement pulled at his shoulder, and he absorbed the pain without making a sound. When Clearline started, Roy didn't tell me what it was. He just told me he was working something big, and that if anything happened to him, I needed to find a way to keep the dog safe. The room went very still. "You're the one who pulled Valor before the scene was processed," Doran said. Brennan didn't confirm it with words. He just looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way people did when they were deciding how far past a line they were willing to go. "I got a call 40 minutes before Roy died," he said. "He told me where the dog was. He told me the access code for the kennel. He told me that Valor wasn't just a canine, that he had been part of every critical meeting, every evidence documentation, every face-to-face with a cooperating witness." He paused. "And then he said, if they get to me tonight, don't let them get to the dog, because the dog is the only piece of this that they can't buy, reassign, or discredit." Caleb pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. "What happened to the cooperating witness?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "Gone. No body, no record, no trace. The case file lists the witness as uncooperative and the investigation as inconclusive." He looked at Doran directly. "You know that's not what happened." "I know what the file says," Doran replied carefully. "I need to know what you know." The witness was a mid-level contractor who handled asset transfers between the department's evidence lockup and a series of shell accounts. He had documentation, physical copies, not digital. He gave 3 of those documents to Roy personally, and Roy put them somewhere safe. Brennan's eyes moved to Valor. He put them somewhere only Valor could confirm the location of. Caleb turned and looked at the dog. Valor had not moved. He was still sitting in that doorway with his amber eyes fixed on Brennan. And as Caleb watched, the dog exhaled slowly through his nose and shifted his weight forward by exactly 1 inch. The same movement he made in the warehouse, right before he led Caleb to the next critical officer. The same pre-motion signal that Caleb had learned in 10 weeks without anyone ever teaching him what it meant. "He knows where they are," Caleb thought. "He has known this whole time." Duran spoke before Caleb could. "Why didn't you come forward 4 years ago?" Brennan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Come forward to who? 3 officers were dead. The investigation was being processed by the same division that ran the asset accounts. I was a junior patrol officer with no rank, no political cover, and a dog that I'd moved before the scene was cleared." He looked at her. "They would have buried me the same way they buried Roy. Quietly, with a clean report." "So you waited," Caleb said. "I waited. I kept Valor moving through shelter rotations so his chip never pinged in the same place twice. I called in favors with people I trusted to keep the paperwork looking clean. And I watched. Watched the network keep operating. Watched the case stay closed. Watched 4 years go by without a single person in this department asking the right question." His eyes moved to Caleb. "And then I found out there was a new handler. Young, clean, no connections to anyone involved. And I thought, if I put Valor with the right person in the right situation, eventually the dog would do what he was trained to do, and someone with enough authority would have to pay attention." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "You engineered the assignment." "I made sure he ended up with someone who wouldn't ignore what they were seeing." Duran had her phone out and had been typing quietly throughout the last exchange. She looked up. "The documents Haskell secured, you don't know where they are. I know Roy gave Valor a specific behavioral imprint tied to the location. A route, a sequence, a destination. I watched him do it during training." Brennan shifted again. "I don't know the location. The dog does." The door opened behind them. 2 of Doran's officers came through, and behind them, escorted and restrained, was the man they'd taken down in the corridor. Up close, Under the recovery room's overhead light, Caleb could see the features clearly. Mid-50s, fit, the particular blankness of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing, regardless of circumstance. He looked at Brennan the way a person looked at a problem they had underestimated. "You signed the termination order," Caleb said. The man said nothing. "You processed the evidence closure on Clearline. You signed a document saying this dog was dead." Caleb stood up from the chair. "And tonight you came here to make sure the two most critical officers from the warehouse couldn't give a statement." Still nothing. Duran stepped directly in front of the man. "The device your unit placed in that warehouse this morning, the secondary IED, that wasn't a narcotics crew." The first crack, barely visible, a tightening around the eyes that the man couldn't fully contain. "You triggered the sweep," she continued. "You needed a situation that would either eliminate certain people or give you cover to access them afterward. What you didn't account for was the dog." She tilted her head slightly. "You didn't know he was still alive until the Sierra 08 flag hit the system." The man's mouth moved once. Then he looked at Valor. Valor looked back at him. And then the dog growled. Quiet, guttural, absolutely specific. Not at Duran, not at Caleb, not at the room in general. At that man, directly, with the targeted certainty of recognition that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with memory. He knows this person, Caleb thought. From before. From Haskell. He was in those meetings, Caleb said slowly. He was part of the network Roy Haskell was investigating. That's why the termination order had his signature. He wasn't closing the file. He was protecting himself. The man said 3 words. The first real thing he'd said since they took him down. "You can't prove that." "I don't have to," Doran said. "The dog already did." She nodded to her officers. They moved the man out. The door closed and the room exhaled. Brennan sank back against the pillow, like something he'd been carrying for 4 years had just shifted off his chest. He looked older suddenly. Not in a bad way. In the way people looked when a weight they'd gotten so used to carrying finally started to lift. "Roy would have liked you," he said to Caleb. "He always said the right handler for Valor wasn't going to be the most decorated one in the room. It was going to be the one who listened to the dog instead of managing him." Caleb didn't say anything. He looked at Valor, who had stopped growling the moment the man was removed, and was now standing calmly near Brennan's bed, head level, tail still. "The documents," Doran said. "If Valor has a behavioral imprint tied to the location, we need to follow it while the chain of custody is clean. Before anyone outside this room moves on the information." She looked at Caleb. "Can you work him off leash? Follow his lead entirely without overriding?" "That's basically what I've been doing since 6:47 this morning," Caleb said. Doran almost smiled. Almost. Brennan cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. The cooperating witness. The one listed as uncooperative in the file." He reached to the small table beside the bed and picked up his personal phone. Unlocked it. Held it toward Doran. "Roy sent me one message the night he died. I've carried it for 4 years and never shown it to anyone because I didn't know who I could trust." He paused. The witness didn't disappear. He was relocated. Roy arranged it before the network knew the case was closing in. He's been living under a different name in a different state for 4 years. Doran took the phone, read the message. Her expression shifted in a way Caleb had not seen it shift before. Not the controlled recalibration of a career officer managing information. Something more human than that. The face of someone who understood that the thing they were holding had cost a man his life. "This is enough," she said quietly. "This is enough to reopen everything." She handed the phone back to Brennan and looked at Caleb. I need you and the dog ready in 20 minutes. Caleb nodded. He looked at Valor one more time. The dog was already watching the door, already waiting. Like the next part of what Roy Haskell had set in motion 4 years ago was simply the next room, and Valor had always known how to get there. He had just needed the right person beside him to finally make the walk. 20 minutes later, Caleb was standing outside the precinct's east exit with Valor off-leash beside him and Doran 3 steps behind. No patrol unit, no lights, no radio traffic that didn't need to exist. She had made 2 calls from Brennan's room and told Caleb that both of them were to people she had trusted for over a decade and had never once tested until tonight. If we're wrong about either of them, she said, this ends badly. We're not wrong, Caleb said. She looked at him. How do you know? He looked at Valor. Because he's calm. The dog was standing with his nose slightly elevated, reading the air in the slow, methodical way he did when he was orienting rather than searching. Not reactive, not locked onto a threat, working through something internally the way a person worked through directions they already knew but hadn't traveled in a long time. Then he moved. Not fast, deliberately. North along the outer wall of the building, then a left turn toward the vehicle lot, then past the lot entirely toward the storage and records annex that sat at the far end of the precinct property. A single-story building that most officers treated as invisible. Old case files, decommissioned equipment, the kind of space that accumulated years of institutional forgetting. Duran spoke quietly beside Caleb as they followed. Haskell had access to that building. He processed evidence for 2 years while Clearline was active. She paused. I never thought to look there because the file said all physical evidence was transferred out before the investigation closed. It wasn't, Caleb said. No, it wasn't. Valor stopped to the side entrance, sat, looked back at Caleb once. Caleb tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Doran. She already had a keycard in her hand. Master Administrative Access. I had it pulled this afternoon when the breach alert went active. She swiped it. The lock released with a clean click. After you. The inside of the annex was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Rows of metal shelving loaded with labeled boxes. Old radios in various states of disassembly. Filing cabinets with handwritten tags rubber-banded to the handles. Caleb had been in this building exactly once, his first week at the precinct, and had thought nothing of it then. Valor moved through it like he had a map. He went left at the first junction without slowing, past 4 rows of shelving, turned right, and stopped in front of a cabinet that looked identical to every other cabinet in the row. Gray metal, 4 drawers, a tag on the handle that read, Equipment Surplus, 2018 to 2019. He sat, ears forward. Paw came up once and tapped the front of the second drawer. Caleb crouched and pulled it open. Standard equipment logs on top, printed sheets in plastic sleeves, the kind of filler material that made a drawer look full and boring to anyone who opened it without reason. He lifted the stack out and set it aside. Underneath, taped flat to the drawer's base with a single strip of evidence seal tape that had gone brittle with age, was a brown envelope. The tape had Roy Haskell's badge number written across it in black marker. Caleb picked it up and held it. He didn't open it. He handed it directly to Doran. She took it with both hands, and for a moment, she just stood there holding it, the way people held things they understood were heavier than their physical weight. Then she broke the tape seal and opened the flap and looked inside. 3 documents, physical copies, handwritten annotations in the margins. Caleb could see numbers, names, account designations. He could see a signature block at the bottom of the second page with a name he didn't recognize, but that made Doran go completely still. Deputy Commissioner Warren Falk, she said quietly. Caleb knew the name. Everyone in the department knew the name. Falk had been with the city for 23 years. He sat on the oversight board that reviewed internal affairs investigations. He had presented the department's ethics commendation at the annual ceremony 2 years running. "He runs the oversight board," Caleb said. "He ran the oversight board that closed Clearline," Doran said. "He signed the review that called the investigation inconclusive." She looked up from the documents. "He was the network, not a participant. The architect." The word sat in the air between them like something solid. Valor made a sound, low and concentrated. Not a growl, more like a confirmation. Doran sealed the envelope and looked at Caleb with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the controlled, operational composure she'd worn since the SUV pulled in that morning. Something quieter. Something that looked a lot like the specific weight a person carried when they understood the full cost of what they were about to do. "This goes federal," she said. "Tonight. I'm not routing it through any channel in this building." She put the envelope inside her jacket. "I need you to understand what that means. Once I make this call, there is no version of the next 72 hours that looks normal. Falk has enough reach to make things complicated before the right people can contain him." "Will the 7 officers be protected?" Caleb asked. "Yes." "Will Brennan?" "Yes." "Then make the call." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she pulled her phone and walked to the far end of the annex, her voice dropping below audibility. Caleb stood beside Valor in the silence of that old building and listened to the sound of his own breathing. Valor pressed his head against Caleb's leg. Caleb put his hand on the dog's back without thinking about it, the way he had started doing somewhere in the middle of the last 10 weeks, without ever deciding to. It had just become the thing his hand did when he needed to feel that something solid was beside him. "You did it," he said quietly. "Whatever Roy built you for, you did it." Valor didn't move. He just stayed there, warm and steady, present in the specific way he always was, not performing comfort, but simply refusing to be anywhere else. Doran came back. Her face had changed again, settled. The decision was made, and she had moved past the weight of making it, into the territory of executing it, which was where she clearly functioned best. "Federal oversight. 2 agents I've worked with directly. They're moving tonight." She looked at Valor. "I need a full behavioral documentation of what he did in that warehouse and in this building. Formal record. It becomes part of the evidentiary chain." "You're using him as a witness," Caleb said. "Roy Haskell built him to be one." She almost smiled this time, enough for Caleb to see it. "I think it's time we honored that." The next 4 hours moved fast and strange. Federal agents arrived without sirens and without theatrics. They moved through the precinct with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of work in buildings that didn't know they were being entered. Caleb gave his statement in the same conference room where Doran had first turned that tablet toward him with the grainy photograph. And this time, he told all of it. The warehouse, the triage sequence, the Sierra 08 response, the route through the annex, the drawer, the dog's body language at every stage, and what it corresponded to in the sequence of events. One of the federal agents, a woman named Carver, who had said almost nothing for the first hour, looked up from her notes at that point. "The dog led you to the documents through behavioral memory imprinted 4 years ago." "Yes." "Without any verbal command or directional assistance." "He knew where he was going. I just kept up." Carver looked at Valor, who was sitting beside Caleb's chair, in the same position he'd held in every room that night. Patient, unhurried, entirely certain. "Detective Haskell's training methodology," she said, more to herself than to Caleb. "It worked." It worked, Caleb agreed. At 3 in the morning, Deputy Commissioner Warren Falk was taken from his home by 2 federal marshals. No press, no statement. The official channel listed it as an ongoing federal matter, under seal. Within 48 hours, 2 additional names connected to the Clearline network were identified through the documents in the envelope. Both still active in departmental roles. Both processed without public incident. Millfield Canine Services, the shell organization whose forged paperwork had placed Valor in Caleb's unit, was traced back to an account connected to Fox Financial Network. The person who had actually arranged Valor's placement, who had spent 4 years keeping the dog alive and waiting for the right moment, was identified through Brennan's testimony and a series of transfer records. That person was a retired K-9 trainer named Gloria Marsh, who had worked the behavioral program that trained Valor under Roy Haskell. She was Caleb's aunt. He sat with that for a long time, alone, in the kennel corridor, at 4 in the morning, with Valor beside him, and the specific silence of a building that had been turned inside out and was still finding its shape again. His aunt had never told him. Not a word in 10 weeks. Not a hint in any of the phone calls they'd exchanged since the assignment came through. She had placed Valor with him and trusted the rest to the dog. He called her. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping. "You knew," he said. A pause. "I knew Roy," she said. "I knew what he built. And I knew that dog had been waiting long enough." "You could have told me." "If I told you, you would have carried the weight of it from day one. You wouldn't have let the dog lead. You would have tried to manage the outcome." Her voice was steady and quiet. The voice of someone who had made a careful decision and stood behind it. "I needed you to just be his handler. The rest was always going to take care of itself." Caleb looked at Valor. Valor looked back at him with those amber eyes that had seen things no dog was supposed to see, and held them without breaking. "She says hello," Caleb told him. Valor's tail moved. Once. Slow. The first time it had moved like that all night. 3 days later, Duran filed a permanent assignment order. K-9 Unit 08 Victor, call sign Valor. Handler, Officer Caleb Marsh. Status, active. Classification, standard patrol. The file that had listed him as decommissioned was corrected, sealed, and transferred to federal custody as part of the evidentiary record. No press, no ceremony, no commendation issued through official channels. Just a piece of paper that said the dog was real, he was here, and he belonged to someone who would not let him be erased again. Caleb signed it at his desk on a Tuesday morning, with Valor beside his chair. And then he folded his copy and put it in his jacket pocket and stood up. "Come on," he said. They walked out of the precinct together into a morning that was ordinary in every visible way. Other officers moving through the lot. Radios checking in. The day beginning its usual accumulation of calls and reports, and the particular rhythm of a department that kept going, regardless of what had moved beneath its surface. Nobody stopped them. Nobody made a speech. But Sergeant Pruitt, standing near the lot entrance with a coffee cup in his hand, watched them pass and gave a single nod. The kind that meant something without needing to say what. Caleb nodded back. Valor walked at his left side, with his ears relaxed and his stride unhurried. And for the first time since 6:47 on the morning this all began, the dog looked like exactly what he was supposed to be. Not a ghost, not an asset, not a classified piece of a buried operation. A partner. Present, loyal, and no longer hidden. Roy Haskell had spent 2 years building a dog who could carry the truth through fire and come out the other side intact. He had been right about everything, except one thing. He thought he would be there to see it finish. But the truth had found its way out anyway, through 10 weeks and a rookie handler, and a warehouse that was supposed to end differently. Because some bonds were built to survive the people who created them. And some dogs remembered exactly what they were for, no matter how long they were asked to wait. Justice in Harlow City did not arrive with a headline or a press conference. It arrived quietly, at the end of a leash, led by a dog who never forgot, and a young officer who had the good sense to follow.